Moving on, we're going to talk about the aquatic fungi, partially made up of hyphomycetes, but basidiomycetes and ascomycetes as well. This picture shows a piece of organic material with some aquatic fungal spores coming off of it. And just for a sense of scale, the piece of organic material is a pine needle. And so these are really tiny, tiny spore bodies. And aquatic fungi are pretty much, they're microscopic. You usually can't see them with your naked eye. So there are 2,500 species of aquatic fungi. Again, the spores are shown on the right. They often have kind of propeller-like forms that help them move through the water column. They are important detritivores, so they're decomposing organic material like leaves and wood. They also can hunt and trap rotifers, as shown in the bottom left. They have kind of an adhesive peg. The rotifer gets trapped on the peg, and then the hyphae are extended into the rotifer and consumed. They can also hunt and trap nematodes. So here we have some nooses, some little noose fungi that like little lassos, and the nematodes get trapped in the lassos, and then they get decomposed. And when you see kind of weird, almost soapy like foam in a river, maybe in an eddy, that's often composed of a lot of these fungal spores. They kind of get frothed up into a foam. Here you can see just one species of fungus. It's a fungus that has motile zoospores, so they can kind of move around. They swim through the water and they penetrate the skin of frogs and salamanders and form zoosporangium. And then they grow and unfortunately usually cause mortality in the frog in a couple of weeks. So the Chytrid fungus is really damaging. There's one form that's damaging to frogs, and there's newer forms that are taking out salamander populations all up and down North and South America. There are also aquatic lichens. So lichens, if you were told, was a partnership between a fungi and an algae. New research in 2016 has actually shown that it's a partnership among 3 different organisms, and a fungi, an algae, and a yeast, so a basidiomycete. This is Tony Spurbil's work from 2016. There are over 200 different species of aquatic lichen. This is a picture of Dermatocarpon luridum. It was previously called Dermatocarpum fluviatile or Dermatocarpum aquaticum, but it actually grows underwater in streams. And there are important aquatic mosses. Mosses are especially important where low light constrains periphyton growth. So you find these in really shady kind of waterfall habitats. There are both aquatic and semi-aquatic mosses, and they have different sensitivities to flow, but they make really great 3-dimensional habitat for aquatic organisms, especially like aquatic insects, because they provide structure and habitat, but they're not as actively grazed as periphyton. So here's a picture of some aquatic moss. And actually, there's 2 species of aquatic moss that live up to 400 feet deep in Crater Lake. So these are scuba divers diving down to collect the moss. And this is Mark Bactinica. I worked with him when I was an undergraduate at Crater Lake, and he is showing a core where they're coring down into lake sediments to collect moss. Then we have all the different kinds of aquatic plants. So we have both angiosperms and ferns that grow in aquatic ecosystems. They're really great for creating habitat for fish and other invertebrates. They help to dissipate energy when they're growing along streams, reduce erosion, and they produce oxygen. So macrophytes can be termed a variety, like based on how they grow. So they can, if they emerge from the water, they're emergent. If they are floating, but they're attached in the benthos, that's what they're called. They can be floating and unattached, and they can be submersed, so completely underwater. Kind of like I showed in a picture earlier on in this lecture, there are two different morphologies, or some plants have different morphological variation depending on whether they're growing submerged or on land. So this is a species of buttercup called Ranunculus polyphyllus, and in A, that's what it looks like when it's growing on land, and in B, that's what it looks like when it's submerged underwater. So these are pictures from Hutchison, 1975. And then here's a bunch of different macrophytes and their floating forms. So we have water lilies and water lettuce and water velvet. It's kind of a type of fern, duckweed, and water hyacinth. And then we have a bunch of different types of macrophytes that you might find submerged. So Lodia, water milfoil, pondweed, which is a terrible name because there's like 3 different types of pondweed, even in this one figure. D is coontail, E is hydrilla, F is a bladderwort, G and H are more pondweeds, just like in C, and I is a wild celery. So then we have some emergent aquatic plants that you may have seen, arum, arrowhead, great bulrush, which is in C. D is wild rice, E is cattail, F is a sedge, and G is a spike rush. So how do plants deal with these anoxic conditions of living underwater or living in wetlands with very low oxygen? There's a variety of really cool adaptations. So for instance, water lilies can uptake oxygen in new leaves and then transport the oxygen down to the roots and into the rhizomes, and then they can push that oxygen back up into older leaves. They can also oxidize the rhizosphere. And so when you have oxygen down in these anoxic sediments, you can find deposits of iron oxide in the rooting zone around the rhizomes because oxygen that they pump down into the rooting zone then rusts any iron in the region. So that's kind of some evidence of oxygen being moved by the plant down into the soil if you find rust basically in the soil. Some aquatic plants have arenchyma, which are these air channels in roots and stems that allow for the passage of gases easily among different locations. They also have lacunae, which are air spaces, and they allow the transport of oxygen down and methane up and out. So it's really cool kind of gas movement in a lot of these aquatic plants. And then we have some species that their roots are just fully submerged and it's difficult for their roots to respire because they need oxygen to do that. And so the plants have developed these strategies for kind of sending projections from the roots up into the atmosphere. And these are called pneumatophores. So mangroves in particular do this really well. And so do cypress. So you see mangroves in the top and then species of cypress and their kind of knees. They're called like root knees, basically. Then there's some metabolic adaptations. So some plants can respire anaerobically through anoxic periods by producing ethanol, and their dead plant stocks can continue to transport oxygen, which is called Venturi flow. So these are just some of the adaptations of plants to living in water. They can also, oh, this is really cool. They can uptake bicarbonate in place of dissolved CO2 for photosynthesis. All right, that's it, plants.